Welcome back to the 8th in our series of devotionals on the book of 1 Samuel, where we're tracing the conflict between the rejected King Saul, who's still clinging to power even as he tries to kill David, whom he views as a lethal threat. And throughout this conflict, though, David refuses to harm Saul because he is still God's anointed king, even though rejected. We noted in our previous devotional the structure of chapters 22 through 23, where David's rescue of the people of Keilah is framed by two experiences of betrayal. It's an ABA narrative structure. Now, while the theme of betrayal does continue in chapters 24 through 26, by contrast, David shows loyalty. Two narratives that show David's loyalty to Saul frame experiences of rejection and betrayal, first by Nabal and then by the Ziphites. And in the middle of this sandwich is the righteous activity of Abigail. So chapters 24 through 26 have a similarly balanced ABCBA narrative structure to the previous chapters. And in this unit, while David does show loyalty to Saul, we don't for a moment imagine him to be the perfect human being. Instead, it's actually Abigail's wise and gracious actions that crown this narrative unit. David refuses to grasp at power for himself, even when treated badly and betrayed, and yet he cannot demand to be treated like a king by Nabal or by the people of Ziph, especially because he's not king yet. So, the first opportunity for David to grasp power presents itself in a cave in the desert of En-Gedi. 24 verse 1. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, "David is in the desert of En-Gedi." So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there and Saul went into it to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, 'I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish.'" Just as an aside, we have no record of God having said any such thing to David about Saul, even though he said something about his enemies, the Philistines. David's men are either lying or they're just mistaken, but we digress. We return to the cave where David and his men are hiding in the darkness, blocked by 3,000 troops outside the cave, and in between both armies, a royal toilet break is in motion. Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went on his way. So notice here that David views Saul as the Lord's anointed. He is set apart, he is holy to God, and therefore he is his master. And if God has appointed him to his role, then David will not presume to know better, to force the issue or to control events. Instead, he trusts God to act. Verse 8. Then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, "My lord the king." When Saul looked back behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, "Why do you listen when men say, 'David is bent on harming you'? This day you've seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, 'I will not lay my hand on the Lord because he is the Lord's anointed.'" So David demonstrates his loyalty to Saul, even as he does right to the undeserving. Well, the next step in this narrative unit begins with Nabal, a wealthy man, a landowner with large flocks. And it's shearing time, a time of great celebration, a little bit like harvest time. This is the year's return on investment, shorn from the backs of the sheep. And David, hoping for perhaps a little generosity or goodwill from Nabal, a little gift of thanks, sends a very polite delegation to the shearing celebration. It turns out that during the year, while Nabal's shepherds were out in the wilderness doing their shepherding thing, David and his men had been protecting them. Not a thing that belonged to Nabal went missing. They were completely safe. But Nabal treats David's delegation with disrespect and sends them away empty-handed. Actually, in verse 39, David says that he and his men were treated with contempt. He had ensured that righteousness was done in relation to Nabal, but in turn, he was insulted. So David's loyalty to Nabal is returned with rejection, a kind of betrayal, really. So what does he do? Well, David gets angry. He plans revenge, which seems a little out of character for David, but the Bible is nothing if not real. But before anything else happens, Nabal's wife, Abigail, finds out about Nabal's terrible mistake, his foolish arrogance and rejection of David. So she quickly jumps on her donkey and chases after David's men with an abundance of food. She says to David in verse 28, "Please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my Lord, because you fight the Lord's battles, and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live." Notice the reference here to David's character, the quality of his character. That's an important piece of this. "When the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing he promised concerning him and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. When the Lord your God has brought my Lord success, remember your servant." David said to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who's kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive." Abigail acted prudently, wisely and graciously, and so prevented David from making a big mistake. So instead of trying to grasp what he thought he deserved, David returned to his position of actually depending upon God, of trusting him for the outcome. And then, as the narrative proceeds, God intervenes in an unlikely way when Nabal, whose name, by the way, means fool, Nabal dies from a sudden illness very soon after Abigail returned home to him. Verse 39, "When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, 'Praise be to the Lord, who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He has kept his servant from doing wrong and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head.'" See, from David's perspective, his encounter with Nabal reinforced his need for humility over entitlement. God alone must bring his vindication. And through Abigail's actions, God prevented him from doing something he would later regret. Righteousness was done. And very soon after hearing of Nabal's death, David sent Abigail a marriage proposal, which she immediately accepted. The next movement in this narrative unit of 1 Samuel 26, we have David and his men being betrayed again by the Ziphites, the near neighbours of David's family in Bethlehem. In the narrative structure, this betrayal echoes the rejection and betrayal of Nabal. As before then, Saul assembles a force to capture David while he's on the run in the desert, and as happened in the cave in chapter 24, balancing that episode, David is again presented with the opportunity to kill Saul. All his troops and guards are sound asleep while David is able to sneak up in the night and steal his spear. Again, he refuses to kill the Lord's anointed. That person is sacrosanct. Indeed, the whole raid is actually constructed to demonstrate David's loyalty to Saul. And as before, from a safe distance, David calls out to Saul and he demonstrates his righteousness. He will never lift a hand against him, which ultimately has the effect of keeping David waiting, teaching him dependence upon God, teaching him humility. And so this narrative unit demonstrates the character of David and even his growth in character. God alone must bring his vindication. In the face of rejection and betrayal, David must learn to do righteousness, even as demonstrated by Abigail. Well, I look forward to continuing this fascinating narrative of God's anointed with you tomorrow.